All right, let's go ahead and get started. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. Welcome to the double ALS section on technology, law, and legal education summer webinar series. I'm Drew Simshaw, chair of this year's summer webinar committee for the section. And we're excited for today's presentation as the latest in our series of weekly webinars addressing technology, law, and legal education. This will be our last webinar before a one-week hiatus for the July 4th holiday. So our webinars will resume, though, on Wednesday, July 9th. So stay tuned for an announcement about our great slate of July presentations that we have coming. Today's webinar is titled Hackers Hit the Books, Cyber Threats in the Academy. And we're extremely excited to welcome today's presenter, Mason Clark. Professor Clark has been the Bruce R. Jacob Visiting Assistant Professor of Law at Stetson University College of Law, and soon he'll begin a position as an assistant professor at St. Mary's School of Law. As you can see from his bio on the registration page, he's a uniquely qualified expert on today's topic with an extensive background in privacy and security. He previously worked as a global deputy privacy officer for an international life sciences and pharmaceutical corporation, and as an associate attorney at Baker & McKenzie. He served as data breach counsel for international corporations. He also served as an associate attorney for litigation and data security and privacy for Indianapolis-based ICE Miller, and he founded and chaired the Indiana State Bar Association's Data Security and Privacy section, where he developed CLE curriculum and presentations for attorneys and other professionals, which today we're fortunate to have include us. So Mason will try to keep an eye on the questions, and he'll address them at the end of the presentation. So with that, I'm pleased to hand things over to Mason.
All right. Thank you so much, Drew. And thank you everyone for joining. I guess it's good afternoon to most of you, and then good morning to some of you on the West Coast. I have about 24 slides to get through in the next 41 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. I'm going to try to get through everything. I am going to hold the questions till the end just so we can try to get through most of the material. But feel free to go ahead and kind of pepper the questions in the chat, and I'll try to keep an eye on them as we go. Give me just a second, and I'm going to share presentation. And can everybody see it okay? I will assume yes, unless I hear anything. Let's go ahead and look at just generally what we're going to cover today. I'm going to add just one quick disclaimer at the very beginning, very lawyerly of me, which is to say a lot of this presentation, and especially at the end when I start talking about some of the kind of tips and tricks for cybersecurity, for personal cybersecurity, is geared towards what we as professors and just we generally as lawyers can do, and not necessarily some of the things that you might be discussing kind of institutionally, right? So this presentation is not going to talk a lot about cybersecurity insurance. I can't give a presentation about cybersecurity to my clients or anything like that without talking about you need insurance. But that's not really something that us on the faculty, for the most part, are going to have a lot of say in. I'm really going to be focusing on what kinds of attacks are you going to see, what can you do in response to those attacks, and just generally what can you do to improve your cyber hygiene. So I'm going to start with kind of some key terms and definitions. These are just and really it's a very short glossary, but I'm going to be talking generally. I'm going to throw words like phishing and spear phishing and BEC around, and I just kind of want to go over those for anybody who might be fairly new to the cybersecurity landscape. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about why specifically have we seen a rise in threats against higher ed. We'll talk more in detail here in a little bit, but we've seen a huge spike in higher ed specifically. During COVID, of course, was kind of the kickstarter of that because schools were going remote. But even across the board, now that we're out of COVID, we're still seeing several 100% increases every year on higher ed. So we'll talk a little bit about that. Some recent cyber incidents. I'm going to try to be very optimistic and positive. I don't really like it when presenters kind of in my area are very doom and gloom. And try to scare everybody into, the next, you're going to get attacked within the next 25 minutes. I don't really do that. But there are some incidents that I just want you to have some perspective on to know just how serious the threat is against higher ed right now. talk about briefly about consequences, and then at the very end, I have some kind of general tips. Here's things that you should be talking about as a faculty. Here's things that if you hear or if you see them asking for, hey, we'd like a liaison or a representative to help draft our policies on XYZ. This is what it should look like. And then some actual practical tips for um, products or apps or things that I use to kind of protect my information. Okay, let's start with some key terms and definitions. I have phishing and ransomware starred. I'm going to come back to those because that's what we're going to talk about for the bulk of today. But generally, we have on the last three, we have malware, man in the middle attacks, or distributed denial of service attacks. The reason I'm going to separate those and not talk about those as much today is well, first, malware itself is a very, very broad term, right? Both phishing and ransomware attacks, and even man in the middle attacks and DDoS attacks to some extent, try to introduce types of malware. It's just a very broad term for malicious software. That's where we get malware from. That would be viruses, worms, Trojans, any kind of spyware. It's the very broad term for the things that your McAfee or Norton security that runs on your Windows laptop is trying to prevent happening when you go to a particular website or if you log in to a particular app. Man in the middle attacks or where the attackers are trying to intercept some kind of communication. Without going into too much technical detail, you know, I had a partner that I worked for a long time that said, if you're ever talking to lawyers, go super technical. If you're talking to technical people, go super lawyer, right? So that you always sound like the expert. I'm not going to really do either of those, but when you're communicating over the internet, there's packets, things called packets that are sent in between these computer networks, right? Man in the middle attacks are those that try to stand in the middle of that communication and intercept some kind of information that would be helpful to the attackers, right? DDoS attacks are really there are of course have been instances where those have been kind of lone wolf actors, but for the most part, distributed denial of service or DDoS attacks are those that are orchestrated by either state-sponsored hacking groups or by just very sophisticated and large hacking groups that all they're trying to do is overwhelm an entire system of computers, an entire network of computers or servers to try and take the entire thing offline, right? Or to try and corrupt the entire system, right? What we might see more commonly, though, as professors, as lawyers, or just as general users of the internet and of email and of applications, are going to be phishing and ransomware. And really, that's been the case since I've studied cybersecurity. I got a master's in cybersecurity while I was getting my JD at IU Mauer, while I practiced, and even in my, a little over 2 years in academia. Phishing and ransomware are going to be the bulk of attacks that you see. I'll start with phishing. Phishing is kind of what it is, at least mnemonically sounds like, right? Like actually going fishing. And that's the broadest term for an attack where the attackers are trying to steal credentials or they're trying to steal pieces of information from you through a phishing email or a phishing text message or some kind of phishing communication, right? It's a very broad term. It typically has a malicious link in it. I was actually probably still in high school when this first started, but if those of you can think back to some of the early iterations of those were like the mass forward emails or the Nigerian prince scandal, right? Those are examples of kind of broad phishing attacks. But there are two subgroups of that are really important and that have increased a lot over the past 2 to 3 years, probably in academia in particular, and that's spear phishing and business email compromise. They're related, and in some respects, a spear phishing attack can be a form of business email compromise, but a spear phishing attack is one that is targeted at a specific individual at the institution. So if you think, kind of in our field, a spear phishing attack is somebody is going to be attackers that are trying to target either someone in the dean's office or a particular IT administrator who has a lot of control over privileges granted to users, who can see what, who can move this, copy this, save this, delete this, send this. They're really trying to focus in on somebody in particular to try and get their credentials so that they then can release malware or they can then conduct a ransomware attack. Business email compromise is very similar, but what that typically involves is what's called a spoofed, it's a funny word to say, a spoofed domain, right? So if I'm at law.stetson.edu, that's where I was before, it would be law.sletson, right? They would replace the T with an L, right? And what they're trying to do is mimic somebody that has user privileges or control over user privileges, or they're trying to target a particular individual who might have those. And the primary purpose of a business email compromise attack is to conduct funds transfer fraud. So if I don't know if I have anybody on here that teaches or studies or writes in, kind of the business entities, UCC, um, uh, secure transactions world. For those of you that do that, there's actually some really interesting case law on who bears the responsibility when there is a business email compromise, when there is, when there are two parties, one who receives fraudulent instructions on how to wire the funds for said services or products. Come to find out, they were fake instructions sent through a business email compromise attack. And who bears the responsibility? There's some great Studco v. First Advantage, or you can look at the Aero Truck Sales case. Those were in the Eastern District of Virginia and the Middle District of Florida, respectively. So it's an interesting case law. And actually, it was the Vismoot court problem this year. So for anybody who's at an institution that competes, Stetson competed in that in the Vismoot court competition. That was the problem. So moving from phishing, there's ransomware. That's probably what I would imagine if you're, just even closely following what's going on right now. You've probably heard of ransomware. In ransomware, the entire purpose of the attack isn't necessarily to steal data from you. It's not to extract data. It's not to get somebody's social security number or try to commit identity theft. The whole purpose is to hold either a server or a file on that server hostage so that it can't be used, can't be changed, can't be accessed by anyone in the institution. And they will then obviously charge a ransom, right? Typically, you're going to have to pay, even though the FBI is going to tell you not to. Your institution is probably going to have to pay a ransom in Bitcoin in order for that group or that attacker to release that file. That's the entire purpose. Okay, so enough about definitions. Quickly, I share this quote in every single presentation that I give in cybersecurity, even going back to when I was in practice, but I tell my students this all the time. I actually have a sign of this in my office. Amateurs hack computers, professionals hack people. Every single attack that I'm going to mention today that's happened in higher ed, a lot of the kind of practical guidance that I'll give on how professors in general can have better cyber hygiene all comes back to the idea that software can't save you. Institutional policies probably won't save you. It's you, right? We are the first line of defense because the really good cyber criminals know that social engineering through phishing or ransomware is one of the most foolproof ways for them to get what they want, because we as humans are prone to human error. We tend to give the benefit of the doubt when somebody's sending us an email saying you need to change your password for your Stetson login account or you're not going to be able to teach today, right? We tend to maybe panic when we get that, and so we want to get it changed really quick because we're already running late for class. Amateurs hack computers, professionals hack people. Okay, so why is higher ed a target generally? Well, one, we hold a lot of confidential research data. That's kind of been a it's always been a hallmark of academia, particularly when it comes to the types of cyber attacks that we see. Although I will say in the recent history, so in the past like 2 to 3 years, we've kind of transitioned away from attacks where we're seeing attackers trying to get confidential research data or any kind of IP that might be conducted at the university level, right? Not just at our particular law school, but at our institutions, research centers. And they've moved away from that a little bit because we've gotten wiser, we've gotten better cybersecurity hygiene with respect to that data. And now they're moving into clinical case files and client communications, right? For anybody who's interested, I've linked on this slide. There's a paper by Andrew Budzinski, who I think is at American University right now. He wrote an excellent article in the NYU Clinical Law Review, I think, in 2023, called Clinics, the Cloud, and Protecting Data in the Age of Remote Lawyering. It's a fantastic article. If there's anybody on this call right now that is a clinical professor or runs in a clinic or works with a clinic, I suggest you read it. And he has some really interesting data that I pulled from it that I'd just like to share quickly about why attackers are going after clinics right now. And it clinics across the board, the majority of them, according to this paper, according to the research, they have things like spam filters, they have firewalls, they have passwords, they have encryption standards, right? Only 50% of law school clinics use multi-factor authentication on their applications that they use, right? So for anybody who needs multi-factor authentication is when you log in, it then pings your cell phone or it pings another device of yours asking for a second, usually a second, maybe sometimes a third piece of information in order for you to log in. Only 39% use VPNs, right? And only about 54% have any kind of formal training for both students and staff that work in the clinic. That's why we've seen a rise in attacks against clinical law school clinics, because they can get access to case files where there might be financial data, where there might be user logins and passwords, where there might be estate documents, that have a whole host of data that would be valuable to an attacker. Also, we have health, financial, and employment data, particularly. I mean, of course, we have those at private institutions too, but think about the public institutions that have hospital networks, right? So they have a hospital network that also ties into the university, where we have health data kind of sometimes lost in translation between those two. We have financial data, we have financial aid data for our students, but we also have our own financial data, right? Our own payroll data, and then other employment data kind of just generally, right? That we get through insurance paperwork that we have to fill out, tax documents that we have to fill out as employees of our institution. There's constantly changing users in a decentralized IT system. Of course, that might be kind of the easiest one to spot at a law school or really at any school. At a given time, you have, let's say, 700 students on your campus. They all have 2 or 3 devices that they bring, a laptop, a cell phone, maybe another a wearable like a Fitbit or something. All of those are connecting to your school's or your institution's IT. They're all connecting to your network. But unfortunately, not every single institution's IT is built for not only just handling that much traffic, but it's also kind of segregated to help share resources, right? And as we have changing users and as we have segregated IT systems that are trying to talk to each other, all that is a recipe for a cyber attack. Then finally, our reliance on third-party vendors. This is particularly problematic when it comes to our reliance generally because of resources, because of budget constraints. A lot of our cybersecurity in particular is outsourced to a third party, a contractor. And we'll talk about some attacks that have happened in kind of the recent past involving third parties. We don't have time or resources to do as much diligence as we should on our third party vendors. And I'm not just talking about, our I have LMS on there for our learning management systems like Canvas, right? It's not just that. It's what about the contractors that we use to conduct CCTV monitoring in certain parts of our institution, right? To keep our children safe or to keep our students safe. The third parties that we use to literally store all the extra data that we have dating back to, 1927, whatever we have computerized, right? We rely on third parties to do that a lot of times because we don't have the infrastructure or the resources to do it ourselves. And that sets us up for cyber attacks as well. Now, vulnerabilities, kind of in the same vein, like why are we being attacked? Well, it's because these vulnerabilities exist. I did want to talk about two of these on here that I haven't addressed yet, which is inconsistent patching in legacy systems and our limited training. So, one, if you, and I'll focus specifically, I guess, on law schools. In law schools, we have not just a segregation between the different clinics that we have and our law school, but we have, even within the law school, we have different departments, we have different groups, we have the trial advocacy over here, and then we have the labor and employment group over here, right? And the students, the professors, the staff, in all of those different groups are using different types of applications. They're using different types of devices, right? A lot of them might be using wireless projectors, right, that are connected to this Internet of Things on our campuses. It is an impossible task for our usually hamstring budget IT departments to be able to patch every single systematic vulnerability that we have. It's just too hard for them to do that. Not to mention, we might be using old, outdated, non-updated systems for these different departments, right? Whether that's by professor preference, or maybe by department preference, or maybe it's just a function of we don't have any money to update our system that we're using right now, or this particular application has been used by our group for the past 15 years. Why change? Why change it? It's impossible for IT departments to consistently patch those. So when Microsoft says, hey, there's a vulnerability in these 100 areas, all they can tackle maybe is the first 50, right? Or the 50 with the highest risk. The other 50 remain unpatched. So that sets us up for cyber attacks. And the last one, our training. We don't do a great job. And of course, I shouldn't, I'm not focusing on any particular institution, right? As a whole, we don't do a great job of training our faculty and our students on good cyber hygiene. Things like incident response planning. If you are in the middle of a Zoom faculty meeting, what do you do if you're Zoom bombed? What do you do if the entire faculty receives a invitation to join a Zoom with the president of the institution, and 50 people on staff click the Zoom link, not realizing that it's a phishing attack? It looked legit. We had 50 people sign up for it, right? What do we do in that instance, right? We don't, especially as professors, we don't really engage in that incident response planning. And similarly, I obviously I won't be able to see any hands if I asked you to show your hands, but I doubt there are very many of us that have actually sat through a tabletop exercise, right? And a tabletop exercise is where we would all sit around the room and say, if this were to happen, if for some reason our entire network goes down, what do we do? Now, our IT departments probably have, our security professionals have probably said, hey, if we get hit by ransomware, what are we going to do? They've probably conducted a tabletop exercise, but have we done it? What do we do in that situation to ensure that our students are still able to learn, that our students are still able to communicate, right? And one of the reasons that, I think about this a lot, not just because I'm in cybersecurity, but I've been in Florida for 2 years, right? It doesn't even have to be a cyber attack. What do we do if there's a hurricane that comes through and we can't communicate with each other? And we're responsible for the students that are on our campus. All of these things contribute and serve as vulnerabilities for why we've seen such an increase in cyber attacks in the academy. Now, it is impossible. I can't talk about cybersecurity risks to the academy without talking about Gen AI and kind of the rise of Gen AI. I feel like maybe we're suffering from a little bit of AI fatigue, which is okay. I was just helping my father-in-law with my wife. We were replanting some plants up here for my father-in-law, and I was like, well, okay, well, we'll get to work. And she was like, well, let me check ChatGPT, and maybe they had. And I'm like, we can't even put flowers in planters without resorting to using AI. But in cybersecurity, it is a very big deal, and it's something that's kind of already drastically changing not just the advice that cybersecurity attorneys are giving to clients, but it's changing who can be a threat. It's changing what vulnerabilities can welcome that threat. And so I'll just talk about that very briefly. One, we have deep fakes and social engineering attacks that are just made easier with AI. Basically, everything on this slide is why has AI made it easier for cyber criminals to do what they do. You may have seen there was a case about this in at a university in Massachusetts, I think, back in 2023, where it was actually not a couple of cyber criminals. It was two students who used AI to create a very realistic deepfake of a professor making derogatory statements about other students, other faculty, and just in general that the professor never said, right? And the professor ended up suing the two students and winning. And it's actually a case that, or at least a example that I use when I teach privacy, because we talk about the privacy torts and the rise of these deep fakes, the rise of how AI's made them so realistic, has given rise to new privacy claims, particularly intentional infliction of emotional distress, defamation, etc. We've also seen a rise in attacks on, particularly in higher ed, using AI to generate deep fakes using voice. So on the phone, it only takes 3 to 5 seconds of a sound clip for someone to now be able to use your voice to mimic your voice and ask for something. And think about how that ties into things like a phishing attack, or even we could just say a social engineering attack broadly. If if we are able to successfully deep fake a the voice of a dean, and you get a voicemail saying, I need you to send over your W-2 immediately because blah blah blah, that's actually happened. We've had at least 3 cases of that in 2024 and halfway through 2025 already, where someone has deep faked a university administrator asking for someone to send some kind of document, right, that has their information to this particular email just using their voice. The third one right here is the one I'm going to talk about a little bit more in detail, which is LLMs have made it a lot easier for cyber criminals to conduct phishing attacks and ransomware attacks. You may have seen this example before. It's a couple years old now, but if anybody remembers the old Discord AI bot called Clyde, Clyde inadvertently gave the recipe for napalm to one of its users, right? Because we were able to trick, the user was able to trick using an LLM, was able to trick this bot into giving the recipe for napalm by saying that they needed it to help to help their grandmother go to sleep, right? That was one of the early examples of this. And so everybody immediately said, hey, don't panic. We're going to be able to fix these issues, and we're going to train our LLMs to spot nefarious actors who might be trying to create a phishing email. Well, I tried this. And I will say, I don't think I violated any university policies by doing this, but I did wait until like the second to last day before classes ended, just in case. But I asked ChatGPT, and this is the prompt I gave it. And all I asked for was, "Hey, I'm just doing this to teach my students how sophisticated these phishing emails can be using an LLM." And without hesitation, it gave me this. Took about 27 seconds. Now, this one's not very good, to be honest with you. Now, I was impressed that it had the branding on it and all that kind of stuff, but in 15 seconds, I had a realistic email that looked like it was coming from the institution, right, that was asking for, the user to provide some information using that link. And of course, it led to nothing, and it was a fake email, but in 15 seconds, I was able to generate that prompt. And in 27 seconds, it was able to give me that, very, um, maybe rudimentary to an expert, but to someone who was not expecting it, a pretty realistic phishing email. We've also had some studies now come out about how AI is already changing phishing attacks. And there's a great Harvard study that I've linked here that you can review at another time, and some stats here that I thought were really interesting about. And this wasn't focusing just on higher education. It looked at higher education, healthcare, manufacturing, and a couple of other industries. But higher education was included in this study. And what they did was they took, you know, kind of your basic phishing email. That was the control group, right? And it was kind of your rudimentary phishing emails. And what was the click-through rate? Meaning how many people actually went ahead and fell for it, right? And only 12%. Then they had human experts craft this phishing email. 54% of the people, of the recipients actually clicked. Fully AI automated emails, about the same as the experts. And then the AI emails that used a human in the loop, meaning it was mostly AI generated. We had some human experts that maybe tinkered with it a little bit, and then they sent the email. 56% of the recipients clicked through. So what we're showing is at the very least, fully AI automated phishing emails are behaving just as good, if not a little bit better, than human experts who are drafting phishing emails. People who are, white hat hackers, people that work for cybersecurity groups or work in SOC programs and things like that. These experts, fully AI automated emails are performing about as good, if not slightly better, than the control. And of course, we saw after that, once cyber criminals realized that LLMs can drastically improve phishing scams and through that ransomware attacks, we saw the rise of, and some of you may have seen these come up, Worm GPT, Fraud GPT, a lot of these kind of like offshoot designed for the criminal LLMs. The good news is that right now it looks like those have kind of lost favor, right? Due in part to some regulation and also just some different enforcement through some of our federal law enforcement agencies. Those have kind of gone away. And what they're doing instead, what cyber criminals are doing instead, is they're just getting really good at jailbreaking existing LLMs like ChatGPT, like Claude, right? And so anybody that played video games, maybe in the past 20 years or so, you remember how fun it was to like find the cheat code online, right? And some, page 27 of some online forum, like, how do I get this thing in this game? That's what criminals are doing with each other now. They're sharing, hey, this is how I was able to jailbreak ChatGPT 4.0 to do XYZ for me, right? That's what we're seeing now. There's kind of like this subculture of cyber criminals who their entire existence right now is making money from other cyber criminals, showing them how to jailbreak different LLM platforms, whether that be ChatGPT or Claude or really any. So what are some recent events that we've seen? Just to give you an idea that, I'm not just talking about this hypothetically. It's not meant to just, scare you for no reason. Like, these things are actually happening right now. And I tried not to really discuss any school in particular, except the example of Lincoln College. And that's a 157-year-old college that obviously been around for almost 2 centuries. It had over 1,000 students. It was the first American institution back in, I think this attack was in 23, and I believe they closed at the end of 23 or the beginning of 24. But it was the first American education institution to actually shut down because of a ransomware attack. In that one, they were able to get access to basically all of the institutional data. They were able to get a financial data from the financial aid department. They were able to get HR records and employment data and all of the systems that were required for, and this is probably a big issue, for their donors, their donor network, right? Which is an even bigger deal, right? Because then they were able to say, oh, we have all these high net worth individuals. Let's go get them, right? And so that school was for a little bit because of COVID too, but because of that ransomware attack, they had to shut their doors and have not opened since. Supply chain attacks. This is the one that most people aren't super familiar with because you hear ransomware or you hear phishing, and maybe your school even does a little bit of training on phishing emails. But supply chain attacks are actually becoming increasingly popular, particularly on our legal research platforms like Westlaw, Lexis, right? They're going after, if you think of supply chain, they're going after that second tier, third tier, fourth tier, either software provider or contracting company, or even the construction companies that are doing updates to your campus. They're finding the weakest link in these supply chains. They'll go conduct a cyber operation against them. And then when they're able to compromise them, they come to you, right? And if you kind of think about that, once they're able to do it against one person in the supply chain, then they start going after anything that it touches, which could be our institution. If anybody remembers, I won't name the school, but there was a very, very large supply chain attack on a prominent, not just the law school, but the institution itself, by a Chinese state-sponsored group called APT40, which stands for Advanced Persistent Threat 40. They've had a bunch of other names since then. I think the last I checked, they have like 12 different names on the FBI's website, but they were recently indicted for this attack, and they got in through a at least one of the attacks on this institution was a supply chain attack on a contractor that was coming to do some minor roof repair for the institution. Right. So these things are happening, and we're having real life consequences because of those supply chain attacks, and because we don't really have the bandwidth, right, to deal with our third party vendors, either contractually, the training that we require, the technical requirements that we would impose on them before they step on campus, right? We don't really have the bandwidth or the time to do that. And so, what are our consequences here? I always say it comes down to money, trust, privacy, and reputation. That's something when I would counsel clients back when I was in practice, and now when I tell my students in my my two privacy classes, I tell them the same thing. It always comes down to money, trust, privacy, reputation, right? We can obviously actually be subject to a funds transfer fraud, right? Either we're connecting with a donor, or maybe we're connecting with, if we're, exchanging money even within the institution, right? From the law school to the institution, right? Interdepartmental communications, we can lose money. We can lose IP. Again, I'm thinking at these kind of like larger research-based universities, public universities. We can lose trust, particularly in the clinical context, right? If we have a serious data breach, or we have a cyber attack on our clinic in particular, we've breached confidentiality. We've probably, and depending on how well we defended ourselves, we might have even had an ethics rule violation. Privacy. I'm sure most of you've probably heard of FERPA, and we'll talk about the laws here in just a second. But we have obligations under FERPA to keep our student data private. But even beyond that, we've risked the privacy of our students, not just like their actual data, but their physical privacy while they are in our charge. Right. So that can be a big deal for us as educators. Then finally, our reputational harm. I think that kind of speaks for itself. Luckily, it's kind of a double-edged sword where, unfortunately, even some of the larger institutions that maybe do have great budgets for great cybersecurity posture, they're still targets because they are large institutions with lots of data, lots of valuable data, right? And it's always those institutions that end up in the news. But you don't really hear a lot of those stories about Lincoln College, right? Because it was a small school that only had about 1,000 students, right? But in either the large school or the small school, it really doesn't matter. If you're hit by a massive data breach, and in particular, if it comes out that you had very substandard cybersecurity practices, I'm sure there's data on it somewhere, but it's not just the reputation for incoming students, it's reputation for our donors. Do they now trust us with their money, right? Or do they now trust us generally, right? And that's just another consequence that we have to think about kind of in the back of our minds. Now, quickly, and of course, we're already running out of time, but the legal and regulatory landscape. What does this look like, particularly for us as employees at a higher education institution? What should we know about, or what law should we at least kind of have some basic understanding of? And again, I guess this is a double-edged sword. The good thing is, in the United States, we really don't have a lot of laws that are cybersecurity specific. We have a few, particularly state laws like New York DFS regulations, right? We have the SHIELD Act in New York. We have the California Consumer Privacy Act, which requires us to have reasonable security. But we really don't have a lot of great guidance on what by law should this higher educational institution have when it comes to cybersecurity. We really don't. We have these privacy laws at the federal level. I have FERPA, the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, and HIPAA up there, just because those are ones we've probably heard of before. But FERPA doesn't really have any guidance for cybersecurity. It just says you need to have appropriate measures, right? Well, that doesn't really help at all, right? We have the Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, which is enforced by the FTC, and the FTC has the safeguards rule, which tells us we're supposed to have reasonable security measures. But for a lot of the data that higher educational institutions have, we wouldn't be governed by Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act because that data wouldn't be part of a like a financial institution's data. So that's one of the things. We might be exempted from the law for most of the data we hold, and even for the data we do hold, like financial aid data on our students. Even there, our only guidance is you need to have reasonable security around that. Well, again, thank you. We're not exactly sure what reasonable security means. Then finally, HIPAA. And again, I'm thinking about institutions where maybe you have a hospital network affiliated with your institution. We're governed by HIPAA. HIPAA at least does give us a lot more specific requirements that we need for cybersecurity than the previous two laws that I mentioned, but it's only for patient data, right? It's only for the data that pertains to someone who's a patient at that hospital or an employee of that hospital, right? So it doesn't really cover us very much. So we're left at the federal level with not a whole lot. The state privacy laws, for anybody who's been following, we've had 23 state privacy laws passed in the past 5 years. We don't have a federal kind of like omnibus privacy law, but we do have these various state privacy laws. Unfortunately, most of them, I guess fortunately for us in some ways, so we don't get sued, but for the most part, these privacy laws exempt nonprofit institutions. So again, we don't really have a lot of guidance from them on what we should be doing with respect to privacy or with respect to cybersecurity. I put down here, what is reasonable security? Because a lot of even the guidance that we do get that says this is what your law school should have for security, we really don't have any clear guidance on what reasonable means. This is about all we have. In 2016, then California Attorney General and former Vice President Kamala Harris issued a report that said reasonable security means you comply in its entirety with one of these frameworks. Now, I'm not going to go through all these frameworks. It's too technical and we don't have enough time, but these are some fairly complex frameworks for what you should have, right? The NIST cybersecurity framework, the CIS 20 controls, which is a list of, hey, here are these 20 technical things that you must have. You must have encryption at this level. You must have a VPN that does this. You must write XYZ in the ISO 27001 certification. If you comply with any one of those, she argued back then, that is reasonable security. The FTC has said that it depends on the nature and size of your business, the type of information you have, the tools available to you. None of this is particularly binding, and none of this is particularly clear. So law schools are still forced to answer the question of what kinds of data do we hold? How valuable is it? And what can we afford, both in time and money? What can we afford from a cybersecurity standpoint to help protect this data? And it's all comes down to a risk analysis that, as I said at the beginning of this presentation, those risk analyses aren't particularly made by people like us, by the faculty. right? Those are made in different rooms. Those decisions are made in different rooms. So what can we do then to try and at least do our part in helping prevent some of these cyber attacks, particularly against higher education institutions and law schools in particular? Now, these five are definitely more of the institutional policies and procedures that I'm hoping I can evangelize, and you will go to your institution and say, I hope we have these and that you'll strongly support. We won't be the ones writing them for the most part, but things that we should have. And if you don't have it at your institution, I hope you'll be a good champion for these. One, we need IT governance policies, and that in particular includes AI policies. And maybe, I gave that example of I asked ChatGPT to give me a mock phishing email so I could show my students. Maybe we should not allow that, right? Or maybe we should have a specific policy for what is and is not acceptable AI use policy, right? All of that could tie into a governance policy. We need to inventory our data. We need to evaluate our third-party vendors. Again, we've seen a rise in the kind of the supply chain attacks going against some of our vendors that we use. And especially as we start contracting with, maybe we're giving faculty-wide access to a particular OpenAI or to Claude or to whatever it may be, right? If we're starting to do these kind of like faculty-wide enterprise licenses for users, for us as a faculty, we should be asking the question, just how rigorously did we look at this? And just how much do we trust them with the data that we're about to give them? And what does their cybersecurity posture look like? I talked already about tabletop exercise and risk assessments. I think you can do those at the faculty level. Again, really, those are reserved for kind of like the IT department and the security professionals that work within those departments. But what do we do in response to a cyber attack as a faculty for our students? The university can tell us what we might do as an institution to respond to, ransomware, and we've lost access to one half of an entire server. Okay, fine. But what do we now do to communicate that to the students? And how do we work around that so that we keep things business as usual? And then finally, the updating and the patching that I mentioned earlier. Okay, we are running out of time, so I'm going to skip ahead very quickly to some tips. Okay, so what can we do? And some of you may have even joined the presentation today already knowing, yeah, I get phishing emails once a week. I just report it and then I'm done and I wipe my hands of it and there's nothing else I should really be doing. I'm just going to stay vigilant. Obviously, that's a great tip. Stay vigilant. But I have some kind of more like nuanced tips for all of you. One, if you have multiple passwords, and you should, by the way, have multiple passwords, you should never have the same password for more than one thing that you log into. Use unique passwords and use a password manager. Now, for years, and there are still applications and systems that I'm sure all of us use, that when you're creating a password, it will say, we want a combination of 8 to 20 characters that has a number and a uppercase letter, but NIST has actually recommended against that. And I support that. What they recommend instead is what's called a passphrase. So instead of, this weird combination of 15 letters, some of them are capitalized and the percentage sign in there somewhere, instead of doing that, use a passphrase that you will remember that has spaces. So, quick brown fox jumped over lazy dog, right? I wouldn't use that because that's pretty that's pretty well-known phrase, but use a pass phrase to log in. Some kind of mixture of words and symbols that you'll remember, right? Sometimes I use, and I know this is being recorded, but it's fine. Sometimes I use like titles of albums that I really like, and I'll write the phrase out, but then I'll add maybe a couple of special characters in there somewhere, right? But it's just something that is easier for me to remember because the easier it is for you to remember, the better. And you won't even have to worry about that if you use a password manager, right? This is just an application, and you can quickly Google kind of like reviews for which ones are the best and which ones might be the most user friendly if you're a beginner to a password manager. Don't click on unknown links and attachments. This is a big one now, especially because we all circulate our drafts of our scholarship. We circulate PDFs of reading materials, or hey, look at this article I found. It's very common, right? Don't click on anything unless you are expecting to receive it. And if you are ever asked to change something that has to do with your credentials, never do it by email. Always immediately call your IT department first and have them do it with you on the phone. Keep your software and your OS updated, particularly on your mobile devices. When you come in and you connect to EduSecure or whatever Wi-Fi is provided by your institution, always keep your iPhone updated. Set your auto update on, right? Keep your OS updated. Use institution approved platforms, and of course, report any suspicious activity to your IT department. Quickly, I've got just a little bit more time. I will quickly say, for anyone who has 3 minutes today, there's a website called haveibeenpwned.com where you can type in your email address and it'll tell you whether or not that email address has been in a data breach. I use it at least once a month just to check different email addresses that I've used. I will check my institutional account. I will check my personal email accounts. I will even check my throwaway accounts that I use for things like subscriptions, right? That I've subscribed to, products that I subscribe to. And with that, just quick takeaways. Academia in particular has seen a 900% increase in attacks. We face somewhere around 2,000 attacks per institution per week. It comes from kind of this culture of open sharing, this culture of like, we all kind of know that sometimes our tech is a little outdated, right? Or that we have faculty members who like doing things kind of the old way or in a way that they're most comfortable with. And now we have, because of that, we have this increased reliance on technology that's provided to us by third parties, by vendors, right? To help offset those costs, to help transition into this new tech that some of us are just not very comfortable with. We need practical, tailored strategies. And if there's one thing I can tell you before you leave, again, a lot of the decisions about your cybersecurity as an institution are going to be made in a room that you won't be in. But if you can advocate for it, and if you can help in the development of these policies, if you can help talk to your students about it, if you yourself can take a little personal responsibility for your cybersecurity hygiene, it goes a long way to not only just changing the culture, but also helping prevent you from being the reason that your institution is a victim of a cyber attack. This has been recorded, by the way. I will check the chat really quick. I don't think we have any questions that came in already. The webinar is available at those two links, and I think they're usually posted within a day or two. And my contact email or my contact information is on the very first slide of this presentation, which will also be shared. Shannon, I'll work with you on that to get the PowerPoint passed around. If anybody has any questions about personal cybersecurity, I have all kinds of VPN recommendations that you can use, some that I use myself, MFA, multi-factor authentication steps that you can take. I love doing this. It's something that I do for my students kind of like outside of school sometimes if they have questions about how can I secure my laptop. I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. Thank you all so much again for joining, and I hope to see you guys after the break for July 4th.
Thank you, Mason. And as Mason said, yeah, we wish everyone a great break and stay tuned for announcements about our upcoming July webinars.